guest today from South Africa, Andrew Olivier. The activities in which Andrew involved are innumerable. As an advisor, artist, book editor, and futurist. He has been archaeologist, belonged to the Marine Corps, had a software company, a multinational consulting company, and now a commercial at ÁGORA. Andrew has advised many public and private leaders of renown. In 2003, Andrew published his first book called The Working Journey, and in 2013, a book in organization and design. Andrew is ambassador of the Global Network of Ecovillage and a member of the Australian Leadership Circle. He has great interest in sustainability and the need for sustainable education. He's a pioneer member of Nanara Ecovillage. Today, in Agora, a place to meet.
Welcome to the Agora. Andrew Olivier, Visions for a World Post-COVID. Welcome to our program, Andrew.
Thank you.
Andrew, you are one of the contributors to this book, which is called Visions for a World Post-COVID. Tell us what it's all about.
Thank you very much, Angela. Hello, viewers. So the book is about what possible futures could exist for us after COVID. And there are many possibilities. The world has stopped. It's had a pause put on economic growth because of COVID. And the world after COVID could be very different if we don't rush back to the old ways, the old growth, the old doing more of the same harder. The world can't afford any more of that. We need to change. We need to be different.
In your chapter, you talk about eco-villages and communities and eco-communities. And what is your proposal?
Okay, thank you, Angela. So let me say what we've seen in the world is, first of all, a loss of biodiversity. We've seen a huge change coming with climate change, and we don't have solutions to that. The governments of the world don't have solutions. We can't just do more of the same harder. So what we are saying over here is that with the changes, if nothing changes, we're going to have lots of job losses, because the world of work, the world of business is getting rid of, they reckon, between 35 and 50% of jobs that we know today. So where are people going to get meaning? How are they going to feed themselves? How are they going to live in houses when they can't afford the houses? So we need to have a different approach. We need to have a different approach to giving people meaning. Some authors in the world, if you think about Harari, he wrote a book called Homo Sapiens. He says we are going to have billions of people in the world who can't be employed. So what are we going to do? How are we actually going to create jobs for them? The governments of the world can't create jobs, and businesses aren't creating jobs. So how can we build resilience, sustainability, lessen our carbon footprints if we don't do something radical? And here is where eco-communities come in. And here is where we have a chance to do something differently. And in the chapter, I talk about how job losses are occurring, and job losses are occurring amongst very vulnerable people, especially in the global south, who don't have access to the education that the digital world needs. So what happens to them?
It's very interesting what you are saying. And one of the things about the job losses is that the governments apparently of the world, that businesses will be in few hands. They will make a lot of money, and then governments could probably pay to all the inhabitants of the world a living salary without having to work. What do you think of that idea?
I think what was quite interesting during COVID, some of the global north or the more wealthy governments experimented with giving people salaries. So for example, in Australia, they had a program to give people money so they could pay rent, pay food. And it was supplement that everyone received who had been employed. And it went on for a year, and everyone got paid a minimum wage. And it worked very well, but the Australian government ended up with a huge debt, and someone has to pay that debt. They've wound the program back now. Here in South Africa, where there's a lot of poverty, where they've got 55% of unemployment with youth, they've tried to create some subsidies to actually help people earn or to have money when there's no jobs. But there's not the money available. The government here is not rich, so it can't do it. And they're also plagued by their own corruption. There's lots of issues. So I don't think that's likely to happen. I think people have to learn to be resilient, and individuals can't be resilient, but communities can. So communities can be resilient.
You talk in your chapter about some communities and some eco-villages, and how do you propose then that this problem of unemployment could be solved by people living in a different way?
Angela, I love the question. I think it's a great question, and I think we have to take a step back. When I became involved with the Global Eco Village for the very first time, it really impressed me as an alternative way of living. And there's lots of lessons in those communities, and I think we should explore that. There's a different way that isn't a focus just on wage earning and power and prestige and climbing a hierarchy, a work hierarchy. The eco-villages and the communities around the world, many of them are wonderful examples of how we could actually transform economies, rural areas, and countries. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but I'm happy to do it now. I'm just aware that once we launch into this topic, there's lots of really interesting communities to talk about. I think what I'll do is I'll finish this, I'll respond to you by saying, last year I went to the Conference of Parties, which is COP 2025, and I listened to different governments talking about the issues, and they don't know what to do actually. They don't have solutions. And Jen and Gaia Education, they have solutions. There are real solutions out there, and many countries around the world are starting to recognize that they have to regenerate rural areas and regenerate cities and build resilience in those cities and build community resilience, because the jobs and the economic infrastructure is not going to be there to sustain them into the future. So I think there's awakening, and I especially saw it in the United Nations, and many of the governments that were there, is they realize they have to try something different. More of the same ain't gonna work.
That is very interesting, Andrew. Now in the second part, we are going to see where we could develop on some sort of proposal that governments will listen to, and that it could be a solution to some of the problems that seem to be coming. We are going to go now to the second section.
Visiten a Chira, uno de los 10 finalistas en el 2016 de los Premios Mundiales de Hábitat, reconocida internacionalmente como mejor práctica. Conozca el baño seco y compostero, la cocina solar, la fuente de la Pachamama. Asista a una velada a la luz de la luna, piérdase en el laberinto, vea cómo funciona una biciducha, aprenda cómo se hace el papel hecho a mano y los juguetes de desechos reciclados, disfrute de una noche en familia en la ecoaldea, conozca los proyectos productivos que constituyen la columna vertebral de esta ecoaldea de mujeres, saboree los mejores platos vallecaucanos, haga sus reservaciones con anterioridad, atendemos congresos, grupos y colegios, visite nuestra página web www.nachira-ecoaldea.org. Corregimiento El Bolo San Isidro, a pocos metros del Parador Alaska. Nachira, ganadora del galardón a la Mujer Vallecaucana 2018 en el ámbito económico.
ÁGORA, Andrew Olivier, Visions for a Post-COVID World. Now in this second part, Andrew, we are going to talk about what you were saying about the proposal that we could make to the United Nations and to the governments of the world who definitely don't know what to do. And also because there is no doubt that post-COVID there is going to be a more impoverished world, more impoverished governments, and somehow you were saying that they have no solutions, and maybe from the eco-village movement there is going to be a solution. And obviously, especially for instance, because there are going to be more poor people, but maybe the solution of eco-villages is a good solution for the global south specifically to solve the problem of poverty. Let's hear what you have to say about it.
Thank you, Angela. Look, I just want to say very briefly, the book is a collection of different chapters that deal with different aspects of the world post-COVID. So mine talks about eco-villages and why, not only eco-villages, it's all eco-communities. So it's urban communities, it's rural communities, it's indigenous communities, because indigenous communities are naturally eco-villages all around the world, and hundreds of millions of people still live in villages. So I just want to say, in the book, I try and build a business case about why eco-villages are so important. So the first part of the book talks about the challenge the world's facing, about the loss of jobs and about the loss of meaning in people's lives, and the growing insecurity there is. And then in the second part of the book, I say there are many communities in the global north and south that have created vibrant communities that are examples of how we might live differently. And when I talk about living differently, I'm talking about each person feeling secure that they have food, they have water, they have shelter, they have energy, and they have a form of safety. And that comes down to making communities of all sorts strong. And I give examples because governments want to understand how this could be applied. And I've tried to give a couple of case studies. And that's when Achira came in. I tried a couple of case studies of how successful these communities have been and how they've built different economies and employ their own people and generate money. Many of these eco-communities have very healthy local economic system. This was post-COVID, but it sustained them. People in eco-communities, in the eco-villages, and I've spoken to a lot, life has continued for them as normal, really, in many eco-villages. We still grow the food, we still meet, we still talk, we still care for each other, we still do the things we need to do. We weren't locked up in flats. We didn't have access. We could go out, we could walk in the country, we could talk to our friends, we did social distancing, we practiced safety, but life in those communities was resilient. So I give examples, Angela, in the book. And I talked about health and aged care, because our health and aged care models are really not very good. In Australia, there was such high COVID death rates in aged and healthcare because they lock up everyone. So I give examples. And the example I give is a German community called Heilhaus, where they deal with aged care and they talk about birth, life, and death. They do the whole cycle. They have their own maternity wards. They have their own doctors and alternative health practitioners, and they have their own palliative care unit where they deal with people at the end of their lives in multi-generational care. And this is all built around a lady who was a spiritual healer. And she brought in followers who came to listen to and practice their healing, and they built a community around that. So that is an example. of aged care in an ecosystem that's a very healthy ecosystem. I also spoke about rural regeneration. And I gave an example there out of Africa. And I spoke about Redes, which is in the border of Senegal and Mali, where the communities have rejuvenated and regenerated the land. They want to bring elephants back, and elephants haven't been there in a long time. But there's almost 3,000 people involved in those communities who are all dealing with growing food, digging water wells again, and they have a very healthy, vibrant community that's supported by links that go into Europe, into the US, into Canada. And that's an example of people working together. Here in South Africa, there's Tolejo Eco Village, which is also a very vibrant community that's doing land regeneration, and they want to build a circular economic model. So when we talk about rural regeneration, there's lots of examples. I mean, those are just two that I've given, and I'm aware of time.
The problem is, Andrew, how do we scale this? How do we get the governments to listen to it, and how they copy? Because somehow they are very established sets, and as you say, people are thinking of going back to previous COVID. People are not thinking of what is going to happen post-COVID and how did people do it. As I was saying, for instance, in Nachira, it happened that we didn't have any cases of COVID. There are 400 people there. Children did the school from home. They actually wander about because obviously it's an open community, and they could pick the fruits from the trees, and they grow their own vegetables and all that, and in a way it worked quite well, and older people were taken care anyway because it's an open door community. But the real problem is, how do we scale it? How do we convince governments, and how do we convince the world that this is the way that the post-COVID world should be like? So what do you suggest could be a good strategy?
Angela, I'm going to answer that question, I think, because I think we're our own worst enemy in that. Eco-villages, by definition, are counterculture. The big established eco-villages, they don't really want to deal with business, and they don't really want to deal with government. And it makes it a problem for us to scale it. I'd like to talk about scaling because I have some ideas on this, maybe in our third part of this interview. But I just want to finish because there's an important point I want to make on these different, and you mentioned Nachira. I want to talk about that because I give that as an example. And I give that as an example in education. We need to have different models to the old models of power and control and hierarchy. And so I speak about some eco-villages earn their revenue out of education. So you think about how Nachira earns its revenue and how it earns its income. It teaches a different way of living. It teaches a different way of living where women are the decision makers. I know another case in Sri Lanka, in a Muslim country, where they have created an eco-village that deals with women as leaders as well. So you educate in a different way.
This is really very important. We are going to make a pause, and then we come back to the third section. Continue in the Agora, a place to meet. Andrew Olivier, Visions for a Post-COVID World. Andrew, we are going to talk in this third part, mostly how do we do to make eco-village also sustainable, but how do we convince governments to accept something that comes from the alternative movement and to make sure that eco-village or the eco-village movement want to actually talk with government and want to change the way they participate so that they do actually become sustainable. What do you think it would be a good proposal for that?
Angela, I think it's a very tough, complex problem. I don't think there's any silver bullets for it. I don't think there's one answer. I think many people are doing lots of good initiatives around the world. I think there's lots of eco warriors leading different movements. I can think of Albert Bates. I can think of so many people who are doing fantastic jobs, like yourselves. You're doing fantastic jobs as ambassadors for change. I think my view is, and I just want to backtrack a little bit, because at the last COP meeting, Jen has been working on signing up a number of African governments on a strategy called the Pan-African Eco-Village Development Program. And there are 12 governments that have agreed that eco-villages is the way to regenerate urban and rural communities. Mm-hmm. So they all signed these documents. This was signed at ministerial level with Jen. But for us to actually deliver on that, we need a business focus. It's a big multinational project. It requires a whole lot of people working together and trying to fundraise, trying to communicate, trying to involve governments. We need to organize ourselves on a different scale of complexity to what we're used to working at. There's our challenge. We find it very difficult to scale up. There's government willingness because we've come out with a way. There's a possibility for us to do it, but we can't create the internal mechanism to do that. So there's our challenge. We have to change the way we interact with governments. And therein lies the challenge. And there are ways we can do it. In the last part of the book, I talk about a way of doing it. One of the ways, I think, is the United Nations has the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sure that you are pretty familiar with those. In 2017, Jen did a study, and it ranked 30 eco-villages against those Sustainable Development Goals, against the ones that were relevant. And they scored it. And eco-villages were living examples of adhering to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. You know, for example, the goal number 12, which is responsible consumption and production. 90% of communities recycle their waste, and they repair more than 50% of their consumer goods, and 85% of them compost food. Sure. You know, and when it comes to clean water and sanitation, which is SDG 6, 97% of those communities active programs to create clean water and sanitation. And that's really important in the global south. I mean, what I think is an area where Natura comes up and many others was SDG number 5, which was gender equality. And there they have 40% of women sit in the decision-making bodies in those communities. Now, to me, here's an opening where we can engage with the UN and governments.
I think this is extremely important to see how we could get governments to really participate, and in the Commission of the Status of Women who has just been taken place. One of the goals definitely is the empowerment of women, which we don't seem to be getting even 20, even 30 years after Beijing. So maybe that is one of the proposals. Maybe it's not so easy to get there. But yes, I wanted to ask you one question. Which are the countries that participated in the Pan-African Conference?
Now, there's very interesting, because the COP25, which is it was held in Madrid because they couldn't hold it in Chile last year. There were governments from all over the world. And what Jen did at that meeting is it went after a current strategy of talking about how our communities are really improving life for the people in those countries, we could actually start creating a Pan-African movement or a Pan-South American movement. But I want to say something, Angela. I want to say something else. What can we individually do? I think you and your community do a lot. I think people in all their communities are doing a lot. One of the things that happened before COVID struck, and I leave this point at the end of the book, is we want to set up eco tours for governments, for businesses, for philanthropists, for people who have the ability to make decisions that impact others, to take them to these communities, to see them firsthand. And we must have had 10 or 12 communities that have designed bespoke tours for businesses and those people that I've just mentioned. And now where we are now with this is we're going back to that idea of these tours to take governments to visit these communities. But we want to introduce it with a book. We're going to have a series of 6 books dealing with each part of the world and highlighting communities and then talking about the tours. And then people can read the book. This is a book that's still coming. And then they can go to the website and they can book these programs and these workshops, and we will have people like yourselves reaching out to governments in South America saying, here are these tours, bring your ministers with, let's entertain your ministers and show them there's another answer. There's a 5th way of doing this. It's not more of the same harder on an old economic model that doesn't work. So there's lots to do.
It is very important that what you are saying, because one of the things that we have done in Nachira is that we have shown a different sort of tourism. People come to the eco-village, they take part in the different things that we do, including recycling and collecting rubbish, and also they live in the houses of the people. We don't have a 5-star hotel or something like that. It's a different sort of tourism, and definitely that will be a great way of showing it. But again, that is very difficult, and it's very difficult to be able to convince governments really to do it.
But we can. If we work together with people like yourselves, with people all over the world, we can do it.
Thank you, Andrew, very, very much. That's a commitment. I think it is an excellent idea that that those of us who believe that a post-COVID world is possible should be part of this great movement that has to do with a concrete way of making a better world post-COVID. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.